Topic 9.10, Human Impacts on Biodiversity. We should be able to explain how human activities affect biodiversity and strategies we can use to combat the problem. We use the acronym HIPCO to abbreviate the 6 major causes of species decline and premature extinction caused by humans. The H stands for habitat destruction. This includes habitat loss, which is the largest threat to biodiversity. This is caused by human development as we build dams or fill in wetlands to build upon. Urbanization also causes habitat loss as we expand our cities into the more natural environments, and then agriculture, as well as our population increases, we have an increased need for farmland. Global climate change can cause habitat loss as we have changes in temperature and precipitation to habitats. Organisms may no longer be able to live there. Same for sea level rise. Habitats may be lost due to the rising sea. As we have habitat loss, we would first see a reduction in specialist species as their specific requirements are more likely not available, and then we would see a loss in the generalist species. Habitat loss also leads to a reduced number of species that have large territory requirements. If there's not enough territory for species, then they would compete with each other and only some of them would survive in whatever habitat is available. Habitat fragmentation happens when we have a wilderness area that we separate from other wilderness areas. This causes an increase in extinction in the species. It also disrupts whatever ecological processes may be happening. It's an opportunity for invasive species to be introduced, and it can actually change the local climate. So if you had a forest population here, trees actually provide climate regulation by providing shade and absorbing some of the sunlight, which would make it cooler. So if we remove those trees, we would lose some of that climate regulation. Smaller fragments mean less biodiversity, which relates back to the theory of island biogeography. A smaller habitat is going to be able to support fewer organisms, so we would have fewer species there. Geographic isolation can also lead to genetic isolation. So typically in our habitat, those organisms can move freely and they can mate with other organisms within their species. But as we create these little islands of habitat, the genes are no longer able to pass as freely between the species. Edge effect happens when we have these sort of islands of habitat. The boundaries of an ecosystem typically have different conditions than what you would find towards the middle of that ecosystem. So as a habitat becomes smaller, the edge effect starts to influence the conditions inside of that habitat, just because there's a smaller distance from the inside to the edge as the habitat itself gets smaller. The I stands for invasive species. These are species that have been introduced. They're not native. They're typically generalist, and they can outcompete the native species that are there. We can control invasive species. The first option would be to prevent them from even entering that habitat. If they do enter, we can use biological controls, so introducing a natural enemy. We can use mechanical controls, which would be physically removing that species, or we can use chemical controls, which would be some sort of herbicide, pesticide, or fungicide, which would kill that species. The first P stands for pollution. So our human activities cause air, water, and soil pollution. This includes, but it's not limited, just a couple examples, to acid rain, sewage, fertilizer, toxic chemicals, solid waste, so all of our garbage and anything that we're throwing out, pesticides, and herbicides. So our solid waste is it's a problem for all ecosystems, but especially aquatic ecosystems, as a lot of our trash ends up running off into aquatic ecosystems. It can physically harm organisms if they get stuck in it, but it can also mimic a food source. So it could look like a food source, and organisms might consume them and they can't digest them. So it actually fills up their stomach, and then they're not actually getting a food supply. When we have endocrine disruptors in environments, we can see interference with our development and our reproductive cess. Endocrine disruptors act like our normal hormone action, so it's interfering with our hormone system, and it can be connected to cancer. They're found in plastics and some pesticides. The most famous, I guess you could say, disruptor is DDT. This is the substance that was in the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It's now banned in the US, but it is still used in other countries. PCBs is another one. Often you'll see when you buy plastic, it will say PCB free if it is in fact PCB free. But all of these interact with our hormones, so they impact our reproduction and development. Indicator species are kind of like a canary in a coal mine. It's an early warning sign of some sort of environmental damage. Amphibians are one species that are pretty sensitive, so they act as an indicator species. In the US, 38% of our amphibian species are declining. We don't have a single cause identified, but it is most likely linked to endocrine disruptors. So deformities you might see, some of these frogs have a couple legs, or they may be missing a leg. So something in their development has a deformity. The second P is population. Human population is really the major cause for all of the other factors of HIPCO. As our population size increases, we're going to see an increase in all of the other factors. So we have increased habitat destruction, fragmentation, and degradation of habitats. We have little habitat remaining for endangered species, and we have an increased use of our natural resources. So as our human population starts to increase and our resource needs increase, we've seen a reduction in species over time. Sometimes humans will domesticate species for our economic return. One species in particular is the honeybee, and this can have a negative impact on the natural honeybee population and can impact the biodiversity of that species. The C stands for climate change. As our climate starts to shift, as temperature and precipitation are changing, we can see habitats are altered as well. As the habitat is altered, it might be impossible for some species to survive, so they would either need to move, or if they have an adaptation, hopefully they can survive, and that adaptation would then get passed along. The O stands for overexploitation or overharvesting. So again, as our population size increases, we are using more and more natural resources. We also are overfishing and fishing unsustainably, overhunting, and poaching. So when we use resources at an unsustainable rate, that means that they're not replenishing and they are being depleted. We can prevent some of this, or we can mitigate it. Mitigating means that we're trying to lessen the problem. So we can create protected areas, we can use habitat corridors, we can promote sustainable practices, and we can restore some habitats that are lost. So in protecting species, here's an example of protecting the nesting sites of piping plovers. These are these small little birds that live on seashores. So if we protect the nesting sites, we're promoting the reproduction and survival of that species. We can restore habitat by planting native species, which would help to restore that degraded habitat, hopefully to closer to its original condition. Habitat corridors are a way to mitigate issues with habitat fragmentation. So here's an example of a land bridge that's been built between two fragmented habitats, and it's a way to provide safe crossing for organisms from one area to another. In the US, we have lots of different governmental designations for creating protected lands. The probably most well-known one is the national parks. National parks are able to be used for recreational purposes, but there is no hunting, no foresting, so it does do a pretty good job at protecting wildlife. We have the National Wildlife Refuge System. This is operated by the Fish and Wildlife Services, and this is protecting wild areas. We have the National Marine Sanctuaries. This is operated by NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Association, I think. And then the last is the National Forest. This is from the Department of Agriculture. And in the National Forest, there is logging that happens. So this is not the most protected, but it does preserve the forest, and there are more regulations in place. For conservation, we have two types. We have in situ. This is happening in a natural environment. So we might, in that last example for the piping plovers, we might try to protect a nesting site or protect a habitat to make sure there's access to the resources that they need. There is no direct human influence aside from kind of protecting an area, and it's able to protect more than one species at a time, because if we're kind of protecting that general habitat area, all of the organisms in that area would have that protection. It's difficult to control illegal activities happening, especially if it's in a remote area. You can post a sign and put a fence up and tell people to keep out, but people are still able to go into that area. If habitats need extensive conservation, the populations might still go down while we're trying to restore that habitat. Ex situ conservation is happening outside of the natural environment. So if a species is critically endangered, meaning there's very few of them left, this is particularly helpful. This happens in zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens. So if you have a captive breeding situation happening, you would breed your organisms in captivity and then release them in the wild to try to restore their natural populations. We also have seed banks where we store seeds for future use if those organisms go extinct, and gene banks as well. An example of ex situ is the California condor. This is a large scavenger bird that needs a lot of territory. In '83, there was only 22 birds. In the late 80s to early 90s, they were extinct in nature, which means they were in captivity, but no natural populations. They were reintroduced in 1992, and now the most recent data from 2016, there are 275 birds in nature. There's 3 acts to try to protect our endangered species. The first is the Endangered Species Act. This is from 1973. It protects species and their habitat and prohibits them from being taken from the wild. CITES is an international treaty. This prevents the trading of endangered and threatened species. This is from the early 1970s. And the last is the Lacey Act from 1900. This prohibits trade in wildlife, fish, and plants that have been illegally taken, possessed, or transported.